Not all remote therapeutic monitoring vendors are the same. Some are going to set you up for success, and others are going to take your money and leave you hanging. My name is Dr. Andrew Grecki. I'm a practice owner. I've implemented RTM in my practice 3 years ago. Now I'm helping hundreds of other practices do the same. And I want to share their experiences. And I'm going to give you the 5 questions that separate the good vendors from the bad ones so you can make the best decision possible when you're looking to implement this in your practice. This is going to be good for you if you're looking to do it, or maybe you failed already and you want to do a better job next time. So, here's the thing about choosing an RTM vendor. This decision is going to determine whether your program succeeds or fails. I've talked to practice owners every day where they chose the wrong vendor. And, you know, I've got a lot of stories. And so one story I can think of off the top of my head, this is the bad vendor story. So the practice signed up with a big name company. I won't mention their name, but they had a great sales pitch, lots of marketing. They promised everything, right? Then after they signed the contract, it was literally radio silence. Well, here's your login. Good luck, right? And staff couldn't figure it out. No one used it. The program died. They wasted 6 months and thousands of dollars. And this is a very common story. Another one I recently talked to, another practice owner I talked to was they chose a vendor that, they did provide monitoring, but the monitoring was terrible. Meaning they had a remote provider that was contacting patients. It was like robotic phone calls. The patients were complaining, why is somebody calling me reading from a script? Patients were starting to ask to be removed from the program, and the practice owner was very embarrassed. Common story. Another big one is, this practice chose based on price, right? So it was the cheapest option. Well, it turned out the vendor was actually taking 85% of the revenue, and the practice was doing all the work for 15% of the money. So, when they did the math, they're making like less than minimum wage for their time. And so that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And these are real stories. These are real situations that I would say they're 100% avoidable if you ask the right questions. So I'm going to give you the questions, that I want you to think about, and it's going to help you avoid the most common mistakes that I see on a daily basis as I'm talking to practice owners. And I think that we're going to start out with the most important question, right? So in my opinion, the most important question you can ask, and I'll be honest, most practice owners don't ask this question, who actually does the monitoring calls with the patient, right? Who's doing the monitoring time, and what's their background and their training, right? And so why does this matter? Well, the quality of monitoring determines everything, right? So that's going to determine patient satisfaction. It's going to determine patient retention. It's going to determine whether your patients, complain or they praise the program, whether you succeed or whether you fail. And so, bad monitoring equals patient complaints and the program dies. Good monitoring equals patients love it and the program thrives. So what you're listening for when you ask that question in their answer, one of the red flags is, well, you'll do the monitoring. They'll tell you that you're doing the monitoring. And if the vendor says, your staff's going to do the monitoring, you need to ask yourself, okay, how much time is that? And that's going to be a minimum of 10 minutes up to a maximum of 60 minutes per month that would be able to be eligible to reimburse for that service, plus a phone call to the patient, right? And most practices, when they ask that question, they don't have the time. Your staff's already maxed out. Like if you don't have dedicated staff time, and you're going to do it yourself, it means the program's not going to happen. And I think most vendors aren't even telling practices this. Another big red flag is when you ask the question and the answer is very vague, like, oh, we have a team that handles that. We provide the monitoring services, right? Well, it's all taken care of. Okay, well, that's not good enough. You need to dig a little bit in there and you need to ask some more questions. Well, what are their credentials? Are they licensed in the state that I'm in, which is what's required? Do they have training on how to communicate properly and encourage and motivate and motivational interview the patient? How do they communicate? If they can't answer those questions specifically, and you should probably meet the person who's going to do the monitoring too. So you want to meet them. Another big red flag is, non-clinical staff. Some vendors use call centers with no clinical background. They're reading from scripts and they don't understand rehab, and they can't have meaningful conversations with the patients. By the way, this is not legal, right? And patients can tell. And if they don't like it, you want to hear that from the vendor. You want to hear our monitoring team is done by licensed physical therapy assistants or physical therapists or occupational therapy assistants. They're licensed in the state. You want to get a copy of that license. You want to meet them. You want to find out, you want to hear they're trained in motivational interviewing techniques. They understand rehab. They've worked with patients. and they can have real conversations. That's what you want, right? And so I think when you're asking these questions, a really good follow-up is like, can you describe what a typical monitoring call sounds like, right? What are they talking about, right? If they say, well, we ask if they're doing their exercises and we document that, that's like checking a box, right? That's not trying to engage with the patient and use motivational interviewing strategies to understand the patient's barriers and encourage the patient to be more compliant with their home program, which is what the whole program is all about. You got to help the patient problem solve, and like, you got to give them real support. Another kind of like digging deeper question is, well, how do you train your monitoring staff, right? You want to hear from the vendor, like the actual training program, like, not just we give them a script, right? You probably want to also ask, like, well, what happens if a patient reports a problem or a red flag, right? You want to hear, like, we handle that immediately. Like, we notify the treating therapist and we document that. And, but if they say something like, well, we just tell them to call their PT, that's not good. You want them to be involved. They're a middle person between you and the patient if they're doing the monitoring for you. You should probably ask about, like, how do they ensure quality and consistency, right? You want to hear about call reviews, patient feedback, quality metrics, right? I'll give you a real example here. So this is a personal story. When I was evaluating vendors for my practice back in 2023, I think it was, I asked this question to 5 different companies, and 3 of them, they gave me really vague answers. And so what they told me was, well, we have a team, or it's handled. The red flags question, right? One said, "Oh, your staff will handle that," and it's like, well, I knew we didn't have time for that. And so one vendor even said that they have licensed PTAs and who are actually trained in motivational interviewing, and they're like, there's call monitoring, and that was actually really comforting to hear. That's what you want to hear, is you want to hear that they're really spending time with these people and training them. So again, we fast forward 2 years later, our patients are telling us constantly that the calls are their favorite part of the program. Like, they feel like someone really cares about them. They're checking in with them. And so, the bottom line is, if the vendor can't clearly explain, who does the monitoring and how they're trained, you shouldn't work with them. You really need to meet the person if you're going to have them do the monitoring for you, you should be able to meet that person as well. This is just way too important to ignore and not ask and not get very specific, examples of it. And so most, RTM programs are failing within the first 90 days. And it's not because RTM doesn't work, but it's because the implementation is terrible, and so you ask the question, like, what does your implementation support actually look like, right? Walk me through the first 30 days of what it looks like to work with you. Maybe you should even get the materials, like the training materials, ahead of time, right? This matters. I mean, you're asking your staff to change their workflow, right? You're introducing like a brand new program to patients. You need to have like billing code set up correctly. You need to think about documentation and compliance. And, if your vendor just hands you a software and says, good luck, you're gonna fail. It's not gonna work. There's so many things to think about that we help people with on a daily basis. You're going to struggle if you don't have somebody like that. And so you're listening for red flags, right? Like, if they tell you how easy it is and, you're going to figure it out, and, no, it's not that easy. If it was that easy, 60% of practices won't quit for the first 6 months, right? It's not that easy. You need support from somebody. If you're paying somebody to provide you with services, you need them to support you, right? Another big red flag you're looking for is like, oh, we'll do a training call. Well, one training call, I can tell you, is not enough, right? You need structured ongoing support, right? Over a long period of time to make this successful. Or if they tell you, oh, you just email us if you have any questions. That's reactive support, not proactive support, right? You need someone who's going to guide you through the process to set you up so you're successful. That is, I think, the most important thing. So what you want to hear, right, is you want to hear, well, we have a structured, week by week implementation plan. Here's what ours is. So when we provide this training materials to people, week 1, we go over account setup with all of our providers, and we get their credentials, and we send welcome emails. We have access to a video course. We give them documentation templates for their EMR. We have scripts that introduce RTM to the patient so they know how to properly speak to the patient. Week 2 is typically a leadership team meeting where we discuss documentation, systems, compliance, how to minimize provider time, how to make this sustainable for the future. The 3rd week is typically with billing teams and We're talking about the unique behaviors of the codes and how to submit the claims and what to expect for reimbursement. And then typically week 4, we're doing like a full staff kind of provider question and answer session where we're addressing their concerns, we're troubleshooting any issues. And then we have ongoing regular support, right? Ongoing check-ins, at least quarterly, but we're there all the time, available for questions, continuous support. That's what real implementation looks like, right? That's what it should look like, at least. So you probably want to ask them, do you provide documentation templates? You want to hear, yes, they're compliant and these are what you need for your plan of care, your initial setup. You should ask them, do they provide scripts to introduce RTM to patients? You want to hear, yeah, we've got scripts that we give you that you can help your team. You want to ask, so what happens after that first 30-day period of time, right? Are you going to continue to support us or are we on our own? You want to ask, like, can I talk to other practices who've worked with you? That's a big one, right? Get some people to talk to that they've worked with, right? If they don't provide references, that's a red flag, right? Not good. We've got lots of them, and so we pride ourselves on those references. On a personal note, right? One vendor I talked to back then said, "Oh, we'll do a 30-minute training call and send you some PDFs." Not good. Another vendor showed me like their entire 4-week implementation plan and gave me like a sample of it and some sample documentation and offered to do a separate meeting with my staff and my leadership team and my billing team. That's what you're looking for. That difference right there was night and day. That's what we do with our program for you. Because the bottom line is implementation support is the difference between success and failure. You don't accept, we'll train you and you're on your own. But you need to get really detailed structure, right? So let's take a minute and pause, and let's talk about money, right? Because I think the pricing structure matters more than you think when you're talking to these vendors, right? So you need to ask the right question. So, one of the most important questions is, what exactly is your pricing structure and what percentage of the revenue do you actually keep, or do I keep? This matters. Well, why does it matter? Well, some vendors are taking as high as 80% of the revenue generated, and you're keeping 20%. And then other vendors like us, we're at 50%. So that's a huge difference when you look at this over an annual perspective, right? Massive difference. Like if you have 50 patients as an example, and you're getting $160 per month in reimbursement for RTM, right? Which is what we're averaging. That's $8,000 a month. If you're with a vendor who's taking 80%, you keep $1,600 a month or $19,000 a year, right? If you're with a vendor who's splitting it 50-50, you're keeping $4,000 a month, and that's almost $50,000 a year. So that's almost like a $28,000 difference a year, just because you got a different vendor with different structures on their fees, right? So that's enough to give your staff raises. It's enough to hire, someone part-time. That's a real money, right? So what you're listening for when you're asking this question, you're listening for red flags like, complicated pricing that's hard to understand. If you can't easily figure out what you're going to keep, that's intentional, right? They're hiding something from you. Another big red flag is if there's a huge amount of upfront fees or monthly minimums, right? $1,500 setup fee and $500 a month minimum. Why are you paying before you generate any revenue? You should be with a vendor that offers performance-based pricing and they have aligned incentives. That's how we operate. Another big red flag is taking more than 60% of the revenue. If a vendor is taking 70-80% of the revenue, they're not your partner. They're exploiting you, right? You're doing the work of enrolling patients. You're creating the home program. Your brand is on the line. Your staff's involved. You deserve way more than 20% of what you're doing, right? So what you want to hear is, again, this is what we offer is we charge 50% or a flat rate per code, roughly 50%. You keep 50%. There's no upfront fees. There's no monthly premiums. There's no, we only pay for when codes are successfully produced. That's fair. That's aligned incentives, right? You need to have a vendor that has aligned incentives. So some good ideas on follow-up questions, right? When you're talking about fees, are there any other fees I should know about, right? Is there a setup fee? Is there a platform fee? Is there a per patient fee? Get it all out in the open. Get it in writing, right? Another one might be, what happens if insurance doesn't pay? That's a big one, right? What you want to hear is you don't pay us unless you get reimbursed. Another big question is, can you show me the math for my specific practice? can you do an analysis with me? They should be able to calculate your potential revenue and, you know, the net that you keep based on patient volume and reimbursement rates for your region, right? Another good follow-up question is there a contract, right? What's the cancellation policy? Is it month to month? You know, obviously month to month is going to be better for you. Are you locked in for a year? You know, is it 2 years? I've heard 3 years from some vendors that take 80%. That's insane to me. I talked to one vendor that wanted 80% of revenue plus $1,000 setup fee. I did the math. Like for my practice, we would keep about $2,000 a month after their fees. And then of course, you know, us, you know, 50/50, there's no setup fee. It's month to month, and you know, we're keeping $80,000. I'm sorry, $8,000 a month, right? So that's a $6,000 per month difference just by understanding that there's different fees and ways that these vendors are doing this, right? So same work, same patients, different vendors. You got to make the right choice, right? The bottom line is don't accept an 80/20 split. Don't pay upfront fees. You know, find a vendor that's truly your partner. You know, the incentives are aligned, not just extracting the maximum profit from you, right? I think that's a really important thing. I mean, this matters. It should matter to you. It matters to me personally, right? RTM, it's a clinical service. It's not just software. You know, you need guidance from people who actually understand physical therapy practice or occupational therapy or speech therapy, right? You know, so you should be thinking about like the questions like, what's your clinical background and do you have any experience? Did you implement this in your practice like I have with my company? You know, if you implemented it, how has it gone? Do you have any real world examples, right? You know, you're going to have questions that aren't just about software. And so, you know, how do I get staff buy-in? How do I say when a patient asks, you know, why we're doing this? How do I handle patients who are not compliant? What if my staff is resistant, right? How do I make this sustainable? These are all really important questions, right? In a software company, you know, a software company can't answer those questions, right? A fellow clinician can, right? Software companies don't know what it's like to be you and me, right? They don't know, right? So you're looking, when you're talking to them, red flags are, you know, if it's a pure software company with no clinical team, right? We're a technology company that serves healthcare. You know, that means they don't understand your world. They don't know the challenges and your reputation and how difficult it is to maintain that. A big red flag is when you've got clinical advisors, but not a leadership, right? Not in leadership. We have a PT on our advisory board. Well, that's nice, but is that PT involved with the day-to-day operations, right? Are they answering your questions? Probably not. Big red flag if they can't answer like operational questions, like if you ask like how do I handle staff resistance and they don't have like a good answer that makes sense to you, it's because they probably haven't done it before, right? They don't even know how to handle that, right? What you want to hear, what we offer, right, is well, our founders are practicing physical therapists. That's me, my business partner. We've implemented RTM in our own practice first, you know, and we're out here every day in the trenches doing this. You know, we've been through everything that you're going through. We understand the practice, we understand operations, staff dynamics, patient communication. We're clinicians first, business owners second. That's really what you want. And there's so many people that are out there, you know, hovering over the healthcare world that are not that, you know, and so that's what I wanted when I was looking for a vendor at least. And that's what I now have as I'm providing the service, right? So couple more follow-up questions you might want to think about is like, you know, have you implemented RTM ever in a practice, right? If so, tell me about that experience. What worked, what didn't. If no, I think it's a red flag. I think they're selling you something that they haven't done themselves, and it's unfortunate. You should be asking them about, you know, can you help with staff training and buy-in? You want to hear yes. You know, we do staff meetings, we have materials, we understand the challenges, and we've come across this before, and you know, you want to ask what if I have you know, clinical questions specific about patient situations, right? What you want to hear is you want to hear like, you know, you can talk to our team anytime, right? You might want to ask like, do you speak at conferences or have you published on this topic, right? Like, are you a thought leader? You know, thought leadership indicates like deep expertise. I've spoken at private practice section 3 years in a row and combined sections and other conferences, right? You know, so when you're evaluating vendors, you know, I talked to one company where the sales rep couldn't even answer basic clinical questions, right? let me get back to you on that, is what I heard. That's a big red flag, right? I talked to another company where the owner was a PT like myself. We talked for an hour about practice operations, staff management, patient engagement, patient communication. You can tell that this person really got it, right? And that's us. We get it. We go through it. We're helping other people go through it. And that conversation made me feel confident. And it should make you feel confident that you're not just buying software, right? You're partnering with someone who understands your world, right? That's important. And you've got to work with clinicians who've actually done this, not like software salespeople who are just trying to, close a deal. I think that's a really important thing to think about. So let's talk about the fear, that keeps practice owners up at night, right? You fear audits. I think that's a really common thing I talk to people about, and so you should ask, like, have any of your clients been audited for RTM? What happened? How do you protect me from compliance issues, right? Why does this matter? Well, RTM is relatively new, right? Insurance companies are still kind of learning about it. Audits are happening. I've been through several of them and done really well, and actually got asked by the insurance company to train their auditors. But if you're not compliant, you have to pay back everything, and that's terrifying. So you really do need a vendor that takes compliance seriously and helps you understand what to do to be compliant. Because the software is one part of it, but your documentation and your systems are also really, really important. So like a red flag would be, oh, don't worry about audits. Everybody should worry about audits. Like if they're dismissive on that, they don't take compliance seriously. Another big kind of red flag is like, if they have no experience with audits, like none of their clients have been audited yet, that means it's unproven to them, and they don't know if their system holds up under scrutiny. So that's not good either. I think another big red flag is like if they're vague on documentation requirements, they don't know, like, oh, you just document what you did and the software keeps track of everything. Not specific enough. You need like exact templates and requirements that need to be in your plan of care, in your documentation, so you're covered. And then what does the software provide if as far as documentation and record keeping? What you want to hear is like, oh yeah, we've had clients audited, they passed, we help them. Even better, we've been audited ourselves. We have, right? We've been audited ourselves, and the insurance companies, asked me to help them train their auditors. That's a real story, and that's a big deal. That means I know what the heck I'm talking about. There's credibility, and you can't fake that, right? So you might want to think about asking like, well, what documentation does your system provide? What you want to hear is like compliant templates for all of my notes, and also the system has a log of all activity, right? You should ask like, how do you ensure time is tracked accurately? Well, you want to hear like that the software does it automatically. It tracks the time. It's not a manual estimation. It's real, actual logging. You probably should ask like, well, what happens if there's a compliance issue? Well, what you want to hear is like, we'll work with you to address it. We're going to stand behind our system. You should ask like, can you show me sample documentation that's passed an audit? If they have it, that's gold, right? We have lots of that. We have examples we give in our training materials. A real story, 2 years ago, my practice in Michigan was audited by Blue Cross Blue Shield, and they wanted to see documentation for 20 patients. Of course, I was super nervous. It was all about RTM. And so, but we had followed all the requirements, and we had clean documentation in our plan of care and progress notes. We used templates in our documentation. We had accurate time tracking. Our software had all the things they wanted to see. There was clear communication notes. And the auditor reviewed everything and said, this is exactly what we want to see, right? And then she asked us literally to train her auditing team because the auditor was unfamiliar with these new codes. And that audit turned into a credibility boost, and it proved our system worked, and so that I thought was a pretty cool experience. But the bottom line is choosing a vendor. You need to choose a vendor that's been tested, that has past audits, that takes compliance seriously. You don't want to risk your practice on an unproven system, right? Some willy-nilly person who created some app. You need to make sure of this. And then a bonus question that many practice owners don't think to ask is, can I talk to 3 to 5 practices you've worked with, right? If they say yes and provide references, great. If they hesitate or no, I think it's a big red flag. I think you need to be able to call references and ask, like, did the implementation go well? What was it like, right? Did it go smoothly? Did you get staff buy-in? Did you get training on what to say to the patient? Is the monitoring quality good when they make the phone calls? Are they actually having a great conversation? Are patients happy? Are you getting negative feedback or positive feedback? Would you choose this vendor again? It's a big one, right? Um, what would you do differently? What would you want to do to know that you didn't know when you signed up? Real feedback from real practices, I think, is invaluable. So, okay, so you've asked all 5 questions. Now what, right? Well, I think you need to create a scorecard. And I actually have created a scorecard for you. So when you're evaluating vendors, right, I'm going to give you an actual like systematic way to kind of score them so that you can come up with the best, possible, option for you. Very easy, right? And so you're going to get this. It's like a 10-point scale. It's going to help you understand like a strong candidate and a weak candidate. And hopefully you weed out the bad ones. And maybe it even encourages you to work with me, with MovementRX. So you got to trust your gut, right? Beyond the scorecard, I think that, learn as much as you can, right? Do you feel like they're trying to help you succeed or just close a sale, right? Do they answer your questions directly or do they dodge them? Do you feel confident that they're going to support you? Or are you worried that you're going to be on your own, right? Your instinct matters, like you're smart. And so you kind of listen to that as well. I've been there, and so obviously I'm biased, right? I run an RTM company now. But again, I'm going to give you my honest recommendation, right? Don't choose based on price alone. The cheapest option usually costs you more in the long run, right? This is just like everything else in life. Don't choose based on flashy features, EMR integrations and all that sounds cool, but it doesn't determine success, right? You need to choose based on, monitoring quality, right? You need to choose based on implementation, support, and systems. You need to choose based on fair pricing. You need to choose based on clinical expertise, proven compliance. These are the 5 things that determine whether your RTM program is going to be successful or if it's going to fail. And so I've created this vendor evaluation scorecard for you to help you speed up this process. It's included in the downloadable guide here that I have for you called the Physical Therapist Guide to Remote Therapeutic Monitoring I made for you. This scorecard is going to help you objectively compare vendors, right? And hopefully you come to the conclusion that ours is the best. But if you don't, that's okay. Even if you don't choose us, you're going to make a better decision than before, I promise you. So the link is in the description. You should download it, use it, make an informed choice, choose the right RTM vendor. I believe is choosing them is one of the most important decisions you're going to make this year. And don't rush it, right? Ask the right questions, do your homework. The right vendor is going to help you succeed. We're here to help you succeed. The wrong vendor is going to waste your time and your money and get you signed up for a long-term contract where nothing good happens, right? You deserve a partner who's invested in your success, not just extracting like profit from you, right? My name is Dr. Andrew Gurecki again. Thanks for watching this. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Please download my guide, go through the vendor evaluation, reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.